30 minutes before a live TV broadcast, the headliner walked out, and the entire show collapsed into chaos. Cameras rolled, the audience waited, and careers were about to be destroyed. But sitting quietly in the corner was someone no one expected to save them. Keanu Reeves. What happened next stunned millions. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The backstage of Studio 14 was supposed to feel electric on nights like this, but the energy carried a different charge. Camera operators ran final tests, adjusting focus rings and wiping fingerprints from the lenses. Lighting crews stood on elevated platforms, tightening clamps on bright white stage lights that washed the entire set in a clean, crisp glow. The studio audience had already begun settling into their seats, chatting excitedly as they waited for the biggest performance of the night. Everything looked ready. Everything looked perfect. The countdown clock above the stage blinked in bright red numbers. There were 38 minutes until the live broadcast. For a show built around music, momentum meant everything. The cues had been practiced. The audio boards were already warmed up. The band members in the earlier segments had run through their songs so many times they could play them in their sleep. This was supposed to be an easy night for everyone. Then a whisper cut through the backstage hallway like a blade. No one shouted it at first. No one dared to. It passed from one staff member to another, each face turning a shade paler than the last. An assistant producer stepped out of a dressing room, pressing her headset tighter against her ear, and mouthed something no one wanted to hear. A makeup artist froze her powder brush, hovering above a performer's cheek. A stagehand carrying a coil of cables dropped it onto the floor. The headliner was refusing to go on stage. A heated argument had just erupted inside her private room. Crew members heard raised voices from her manager. The singer's latest contract demands had clashed with the network's policy, and neither side would budge. She shouted that she wouldn't perform unless certain clauses were rewritten. Her agent shouted louder. By the time security was called to clear the hallway, the decision had already been made. She was not going on stage. What followed was immediate chaos. Assistants wearing headsets sprinted across the hall, trying to confirm what they were hearing. One producer held both hands on top of his head, pacing in circles as he issued orders into his mic. The director slammed his clipboard onto a table so hard that the pens inside the metal cup rattled. Someone tried calling the singer's management again, only to be met with a voicemail that sounded painfully calm compared to the panic rising in the room. The entire show had been sold on her performance. Her name was on the posters. She was the centerpiece of all the advertisements. The network had spent a small fortune promoting her appearance, betting that her fan base would bring in one of the highest viewership counts of the season. Without her, the show wasn't just missing a performance. It was missing its heart. Marcus Hale stood at the center of the storm. In his early 50s, with streaks of gray in his hair, he had built his career producing live TV. He had survived technical blackouts, last-minute rewrites, and artists who forgot lyrics, but he had never faced a collapse like this. His hands trembled as he stared up at the countdown clock. 38 minutes. That was all the time left before millions of viewers would expect a show he no longer had. And in the far end of the hallway, unnoticed by most, Keanu Reeves sat quietly on a folding chair. He watched the panic unfold with calm, steady eyes, sensing how deeply the night was beginning to crack. Keanu had arrived earlier that afternoon with no intention of becoming part of the broadcast. He wasn't scheduled to perform, wasn't listed anywhere on the show's lineup, and wasn't sitting in a VIP room surrounded by photographers. He preferred the quiet corner of the backstage hallway where he could support Jamie Rivera, the young indie singer he had been mentoring for the past year. Jamie was already nervous about her small segment in the show, and Keanu wanted her to feel grounded. He spoke to her softly about focusing on the emotion of her music, not the cameras waiting beyond the stage. But as the crisis deepened, even Jamie could feel the tension. A makeup artist excused herself mid-sentence and rushed toward the producer's office. A camera assistant ran down the hall so quickly that he bumped into a stack of prop crates, sending them rattling against the wall. The sound echoed through the corridor like a warning. Jamie's breathing grew shallow as she realized something terrible was happening. Keanu placed a steady hand on her shoulder. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone reassured her, but even he couldn't ignore the rising panic expanding through the building like a fast-moving wave. Crew members whispered things like, "We're done, and this is impossible," as they passed by. One audio engineer slumped into a folding chair, rubbing her forehead in defeat. The show depended on precision. Losing the headliner meant losing the roadmap, losing the schedule, and losing the one moment advertisers had spent weeks paying for. Marcus Hale stepped out of the control room once more, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The red glow of the countdown clock reflected in his exhausted eyes. 34 minutes. Time slipped away faster than anyone could think. He barked orders at the assistants, telling them to find any viable replacement. But most artists on the lineup had their own segments prepared, not the emotional finale that the headliner was contracted for. Some had smaller voices, others specialized in completely different styles. No one had the music ready, no one had rehearsed the centerpiece act. It wasn't just about finding someone who could sing, it was about finding someone who could lead the broadcast's most demanding moment with only minutes to prepare. The band members who were supposed to play with the headliner gathered near the stage entrance. The guitarist leaned against an amplifier, muttering frustrations under his breath. The drummer tapped restless patterns on his thigh, unable to stay still. They had trained for one song, one arrangement, one emotional climax. Now all of it was useless. Their instruments sat ready, but their performance had nowhere to go. Jamie watched them, nervously tightening her grip on the guitar case she carried. She whispered to Keanu, asking if the show might get canceled. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes followed Marcus, who stood frozen beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, looking smaller than a man used to leading hundreds. The pressure on him was crushing. He knew sponsors were expecting numbers. He knew the network executives would be furious. He knew a failed broadcast could cost some crew members their jobs. And the clock kept ticking. Somewhere deep in his chest, Marcus felt the sinking realization that this night might end in disaster. Marcus stepped closer to the stage entrance, staring at the sea of lights glowing across the set. The audience was laughing and chatting, unaware that everything behind the curtain was moments away from falling apart. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he imagined the countdown reaching zero with no performer to step into that final spotlight. The thought alone made his vision blur for a second. He pressed his palms against the railing, trying to steady his breath. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't just protecting a show, he was protecting the crew who relied on this broadcast for their next paycheck. The young artists who came hoping to be discovered and the reputation he had spent years building. A single cancellation was enough to undo all of it. Behind him, another argument erupted between two technicians about backup plans that clearly weren't going to work. A stage manager dropped her clipboard and leaned against the wall, her eyes welling with tears. Even the band members looked defeated, sitting beside their instruments with expressions that mixed frustration and helplessness. Keanu remained seated in the far corner, still unnoticed by most. He watched the unraveling quietly, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharply focused. The pain in the room wasn't loud, but he could feel it as clearly as if someone had spoken it aloud. It was the kind of pain that came from people caring deeply about something slipping out of their control. Jamie sat beside him, frightened by the intensity around her. She whispered a question he couldn't immediately answer. And then Marcus looked up again at the countdown clock flashing its merciless red glow. 31 minutes until live. "The whole show is going to collapse," he whispered. The day had started out calm. The sun filtered through the high windows of the studio complex as crew members unloaded equipment from rolling cases and tested cables stretched across the floor. The building carried the usual hum of preparation. Nothing felt unusual at first. Marcus Hale moved through the silent rehearsal stage with his tablet in hand, checking off items on the morning list. Sound checks were scheduled, lighting adjustments were mapped out, and the artists were lined up for back-to-back run-throughs. This was supposed to be an easy show, not simple, but predictable. Marcus liked predictability. He greeted the musicians as they stepped onto the stage, nodding to the drummers, tuning their snares, and the guitarists warming up with quiet strums. Everything sounded routine. He walked to the control booth and listened carefully as the audio team tested each microphone. The levels came in clean. The backup lights came on without flickering. Every indicator pointed to a smooth night ahead. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves arrived quietly through the side entrance. He wore a black jacket, jeans, and a pair of worn boots that matched his preference for comfort over attention. Some staff members recognized him immediately, but he didn't linger long enough for anyone to swarm him. He headed straight toward the rehearsal rooms, where Jamie Rivera was pacing back and forth with her guitar. Jamie was 23 years old, with nervous eyes and a soft-spoken voice that struggled to rise above her shyness. This was the biggest stage she had ever stepped onto, and it showed in every anxious gesture. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the strap on her guitar. She whispered lyrics under her breath, repeating lines over and over again. Keanu approached with a warm calmness that softened the tension in the room. He told her to breathe. He told her to focus on why she started making music in the first place. He reminded her that feeling afraid didn't mean she wasn't ready. It meant she cared. Jamie looked at him like someone clinging to a lifeline in rough water. She trusted him completely, and it steadied her enough to walk into her rehearsal slot when the stage manager called her name. Keanu waited near the wings as she performed. She sang her song in a low, trembling voice that gradually strengthened with each note. By the end of her rehearsal, she stood tall enough to earn an approving nod from Marcus and a quiet clap from the lighting crew. Jamie stepped off the stage with a shy smile, grateful for the small victory. Rehearsals continued through the morning. Keanu found a spot in the hallway where he could watch different artists run through their sets. He liked standing slightly apart from everything, taking in the energy without becoming the center of it. His jacket hung loosely around him, and his hair fell slightly over his forehead as he listened to the echoing sounds of instruments and young voices. He didn't offer advice unless someone asked. He didn't interrupt anyone's process. He simply supported Jamie and observed the world around him. Everything seemed to be moving the way live shows usually did. Nothing felt out of place, not yet. But all of that changed the moment the whisper arrived that the headliner was refusing to go on stage. The news reached the hallway in an instant, but no one understood it at first. A production assistant hurried past with her headset pressed tightly against her ear, whispering frantically into her mic. She almost collided with a cameraman carrying a tripod. He caught her by the elbow, asked what was wrong, and she shook her head with wide, frightened eyes before rushing toward the producer's office. That alone was enough to alert everyone nearby that something serious was happening. Jamie was packing her guitar when she heard the murmurs. Her shoulders stiffened. She glanced at Keanu with confusion, searching his expression for answers. But he didn't have any yet. He watched the hallway, carefully reading the tension in every face that passed by. Another assistant sprinted toward the stage entrance with a printed schedule in hand, shaking her head as she muttered about timing and sponsors. A group of backup dancers stepped aside to let her through, whispering among themselves in growing panic. Within minutes, the energy of the building shifted from orderly rehearsal to frantic crisis. Keanu stood beside Jamie, gently placing a hand on her guitar case to keep her grounded. He wanted to shield her from the storm, even though he could feel its weight pressing in on all sides. Crew members gathered near a laptop set up on a tall equipment case. One of them typed furiously, while the others leaned in, scanning a list of possible replacement performers. Their voices overlapped in a mess of questions and half-formed ideas. "Can she do it?" someone asked. "No chance. She doesn't know the arrangement." "What about him?" "He has the voice, but he doesn't have the following. Sponsors will explode." A frustrated technician threw his hands up and said they were wasting time. Another argued that anyone was better than no one, but as the list of potential replacements grew longer, the disappointment on their faces grew heavier. Every name came with a reason it couldn't work. No one matched the headliner's draw. No one had the right song prepared. No one had the presence to close a live broadcast with only minutes of rehearsal. The hallway filled with worried chatter. Artists who hadn't heard the full story tried to piece it together through broken sentences floating from room to room. Stagehands exchanged glances, already preparing for the possibility of a shortened show. Even the security guards shifted positions nervously, sensing the urgency that had begun to seep into every corner of the building. Jamie clutched the strap of her guitar case. She wasn't scheduled anywhere near the headliner's slot, but seeing such panic sent a chill through her. She whispered to Keanu, asking if the show might be canceled. He didn't answer right away. He watched the group crowded around the laptop, their faces tightening with every passing moment. Keanu didn't want to insert himself into the crisis. It wasn't his place. He wasn't part of the lineup. He wasn't part of the crew. He had come only to support Jamie and enjoy the passion of rising artists finding their voice on stage. This was their moment, not his. But as more assistants rushed into the hallway and more performers whispered anxiously, it became clear the night was unraveling faster than anyone could contain. The whispers had grown into urgent discussions. The urgent discussions had turned into desperate pleas for solutions. And through it all, Keanu watched silently, knowing the show was one misstep away from disaster. The tension in the hallway thickened as more crew members joined the frantic discussion. Someone pulled up a list of local performers, hoping to find an artist nearby who could rush to the studio in time. Another called a talent agency, begging for anyone with enough stage presence to salvage the broadcast. But every option collapsed under the same impossible conditions. The show was too close to airing. The expectations were too high. And the headliner's absence created a void no one seemed able to fill. Even the band members assigned to the final number stood frozen with uncertainty. The bassist leaned against a sound cart, shaking his head as he reread his own notes for the song they had prepared. The pianist paced in small, restless circles, muttering that they couldn't improvise an entirely new arrangement this late. They all sensed how fragile the night had suddenly become. Jamie kept glancing at the clock hanging above the corridor. The red numbers blinked like a warning signal. She wasn't supposed to be part of the chaos, but it surrounded her anyway. She whispered that maybe the headliner would change her mind, even though her voice lacked conviction. When Keanu looked at her, he saw the same nervousness she had carried into rehearsal, now magnified by the storm unfolding around them. He offered a gentle reassurance, telling her that her job hadn't changed. She had done her part well. She had shown up prepared. The chaos happening now wasn't hers to carry. But even as he said it, Keanu couldn't ignore the magnitude of what the show was facing. Assistants rushed past them with stacks of papers that no longer mattered. Techs fiddled with equipment that might not even be used. A producer rubbed his temples so hard it looked painful. The director snapped at someone over the walkie, then apologized immediately, his frustration spilling out, despite his best efforts to contain it. Keanu stayed still, watching everything unfold, like a man sitting at the eye of a storm. He didn't interfere, didn't offer a suggestion, didn't draw attention to himself. He understood that this wasn't his world tonight. He was simply a guest. But as he observed the worry spreading through every corner of the studio, he realized one quiet truth. The show wasn't just unraveling. It was reaching a breaking point no one knew how to stop. Marcus Hale stormed into the small producer's office, shoved the door closed with his shoulder, and immediately grabbed the first phone he saw. He didn't have time to sit. He didn't even have time to think. He called the headliner's manager, again hoping for a last-second miracle, but the call went straight to voicemail. He left a desperate message promising to renegotiate anything if they would just get her on stage. When he hung up, his hand shook so badly he nearly dropped the phone. He dialed another number. This time it was the agent of a mid-level pop singer who sometimes performed live on short notice. The agent answered, but the news came fast and cold. The singer was out of state hours away. No chance. Marcus hung up and immediately switched to another contact. Then another, then another. Every call ended the same way. No one was available. No one could make it in time. No one could save the broadcast. He ran both hands through his hair, pacing in tight circles across the cluttered office. His assistant, overwhelmed and red-faced, burst in with a printed list of local performers who had decent followings. Marcus scanned the names quickly. Some were talented, some were promising, but none of them were prepared for a national live broadcast with millions watching. He tried calling anyway. One potential performer was already booked at a wedding. Another was sick. A third was driving upstate for a family emergency. He reached a local bar singer who had a strong voice, only to learn he had no transportation to make it to the studio. Marcus offered to send a car, but even with that, he wouldn't arrive in time for rehearsal. The clock kept racing forward. The pressure inside the room felt suffocating. Marcus slammed the phone on the desk, exhaling in a way that sounded more like a broken gasp. He stepped out into the hallway and was met with an explosion of noise. Technicians argued about how many minutes of filler content they could stretch. Stagehands whispered about cutting entire segments. Several young musicians stood near the wall, their faces pale as they wondered if their small performances would be canceled entirely. The band assigned to the headliner gathered in their dressing area. The guitarist, unable to contain his frustration, threw his pick across the room. It bounced off an amplifier and skidded beneath a chair. The drummer shook his head repeatedly and muttered that they might as well walk out. They had prepared for weeks, rehearsed every beat, memorized every cue, and now they had no vocalist and no purpose. Their instruments sat ready, but the performance they built their night around had vanished. The network executive marched down the hall like a storm. He cornered Marcus near the control room entrance and demanded answers in a low, heated voice. He warned that the network could face enormous backlash if the final act failed or if the show collapsed on air. He reminded Marcus of the advertisers, the sponsors, the viewers, expecting something extraordinary. Marcus tried to explain the situation, but he barely got 2 sentences out before the executive cut him off and repeated the same threat. Everyone felt like they were running out of time, and the countdown clock outside the main stage confirmed it. 22 minutes until live. The hallway outside the control room had turned into a crisis center. Assistants carrying clipboards stood in scattered clusters arguing about possible emergency transitions. Someone suggested extending the comedy segment. Someone else countered that the comedian had only prepared 5 minutes of material and wasn't comfortable with improvisation. A third person proposed re-airing a pre-recorded performance from last season, but that idea was immediately shut down because the show had been heavily promoted as a fully live broadcast. Every solution felt like a bandage on a wound that was bleeding too fast to control. The makeup crew, who normally bustled with brushes and palettes, had nothing to do. Their stations sat untouched. A few artists sat slumped against the wall, legs crossed, brushes idle in their laps. One of them rested her forehead against her knees, trying not to cry from the pressure radiating through the building. They looked lost without direction, waiting for Marcus to tell them whether there would even be a show to prepare anyone for. The young musicians scheduled earlier in the program huddled near the end of the hallway. Their faces carried the same mixture of fear and disappointment. They had come hoping to shine for a few minutes on national television, but with the schedule collapsing, they worried their segments would be cut entirely. A guitarist wiped sweaty palms on his jeans. A violinist chewed her lip until it turned pale. They whispered among themselves, wondering what would happen if the broadcast went off the rails. Through all of this, Jamie Rivera stood near Keanu, shrinking a little more every minute. The noise, the shouting, the frantic pacing, it weighed heavily on her. This was supposed to be her first major TV experience, a chance to prove she belonged in the music world. Instead, she felt like she had stepped into a disaster she wasn't prepared for. She clutched her guitar case against her chest like a shield, hoping no one would ask her to step into the chaos unfolding around them. Keanu noticed the tension tightening her shoulders. He moved a little closer, shielding her from the rush of people passing by. He spoke softly to her, reminding her that none of what was happening was her fault. She had performed beautifully in rehearsal. She had done exactly what she came to do. The chaos belonged to the adults in charge, not to her. Even so, Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. She kept glancing at the band members who looked ready to abandon ship. She looked at the exhausted crew members leaning against walls. She saw one assistant producer tugging at her hair in frustration. Everything she saw told her the night was falling apart. Keanu kept his posture steady, but inside he could feel the same sadness. He had been around enough productions to recognize when a show was about to crumble. The panic had reached that dangerous point where people stopped thinking clearly and started acting out of fear. He watched Marcus step back into the hallway, his expression hollow and his shoulders sagging. The producer looked like a man walking through smoke with no way out. And above them all, mounted on the wall like a relentless reminder, the countdown clock flashed its harsh red numbers. 22 minutes until live. The pressure in the hallway seemed to vibrate through the floors as the minutes disappeared. Marcus moved toward the stage entrance again, stopping only when another crew member flagged him down with a handful of notes that offered no real solutions. He skimmed them, shook his head, and handed them back without saying a word. His silence spoke louder than any outburst. It told the entire staff that the situation was slipping beyond his control. A boom mic operator leaned against a doorframe, staring blankly at the floor. A lighting tech paced back and forth, tapping her fingers nervously against her arm. People who normally acted with precision now looked paralyzed by uncertainty, waiting for someone, anyone to give direction. Jamie watched it all from beside Keanu, her breath tight in her chest. She felt the weight of the panic, even though she wasn't part of the headliner's team. She whispered that she wished she could help somehow, even though she knew she wasn't the solution the show needed. Keanu told her she didn't have to fix anything. She just had to stay calm and hold on to the confidence she earned in rehearsal. Still, he couldn't ignore the unease radiating from her. He saw how each frantic shout, each slammed door, each defeated sigh pushed her deeper into her own fear. This wasn't the introduction to the industry he wanted for her. He didn't want her first major television appearance to be remembered as a nightmare. He kept close to her, creating a small pocket of calm amid the storm. It was the only thing he could offer. But even with his presence, the truth hung heavy in the air. The show was crumbling, people were running out of time, and the countdown clock kept flashing its merciless warning. 22 minutes until live. The hallway had become a blur of hurried footsteps and stressed voices when Rick Sandoval, the senior audio technician, finally stepped away from the mixing console. At 40 years old, he had spent half his life working in club studios and backstage corners of live productions. He had seen his share of disasters and close calls, and he prided himself on being level-headed when others panicked. But even he felt the weight of tonight pressing down harder than usual. Rick had been rewiring a stubborn monitor cable when he paused, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The tension in the building made it hard to think clearly, but something tugged at the corner of his mind, a thought he couldn't quite place. He glanced down the hallway, scanning the crowd of worried faces. Crew members rushed past him without making eye contact. Performers whispered in tight clusters, hoping for direction. Then his eyes settled on one figure who didn't match the panic surrounding him. Keanu Reeves sat calmly beside Jamie Rivera, speaking to her softly. His posture was relaxed, almost serene, as if he were sitting in a quiet cafe rather than a collapsing production. The soft hallway lighting washed over his face, giving him a steady, grounded presence. Rick stared for a long moment, not because Keanu was famous, but because something about the sight triggered a memory buried deep in the back of his mind. A memory of dimly lit clubs in Los Angeles, nights filled with gritty grunge, thick cigarette smoke, and raw, echoing bass lines vibrating through the floorboards. Rick narrowed his eyes. He remembered that face, not from movie posters or interviews, but from years ago, standing under stage lights with a bass guitar strapped across his shoulder. He whispered to himself, "That can't be him, can it?" The thought wouldn't leave him. He straightened up, heart beating faster as he replayed the memory. He had mixed sound during a Dogstar performance once, back when the band toured small venues. He remembered the crowd's surprise when they realized the quiet bassist was the same man they had seen on the big screen. He remembered the humility Keanu carried, the way he always thanked the crew, the way he never acted like he was above anyone else. Rick looked again, and everything clicked into place. It really was him. He nudged the nearest crew member, a young lighting assistant, who was anxiously adjusting a bundle of cables. Rick whispered, asking if they knew Keanu Reeves was sitting right there. The assistant froze mid-motion and shook her head, slowly confused. Rick leaned closer and whispered, "He used to sing and play bass. He did it live. Dog Star, Los Angeles clubs, I've seen him do it." The assistant's eyes widened. She turned to tell another crew member. And just like that, the whisper began to spread through the hallway. Some people reacted with disbelief. Others didn't even know Keanu was in the building. A few scoffed, convinced it had to be a mix-up, but the rumor had already taken root. Keanu, hearing faint murmurs of his own name, offered Jamie a reassuring smile. He didn't want her to notice the shift in attention. He didn't want anyone to think he was involved in the chaos swirling around them. But Rick couldn't ignore his instinct. For the first time that night, he sensed a sliver of possibility. The whisper moved through the hallway like a slow, uncertain tide. A camera operator overheard it and nudged the assistant director. The assistant director frowned, uncertain whether to believe it. A makeup artist overheard the second retelling and blinked in surprise, glancing toward Keanu with a mixture of curiosity and doubt. Each time the message passed from one person to the next, it grew slightly more confident, slightly more urgent, as if the building itself was piecing together a forgotten truth. By the time the rumor reached the cluster of band members waiting near the stage entrance, the guitarist stopped pacing and stared down the hallway. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. He knew Keanu Reeves as an actor, not as someone who could fill a live performance slot with almost no preparation. He shook his head and muttered that people were losing their minds from stress. But even as he said it, he kept staring. The drummer crossed his arms and frowned. He had been gripping his drumstick so tightly that his knuckles were white. The idea sounded ridiculous, absurd even. But the panic of the last half hour had left everyone grasping for any thread of hope. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of impossibility pressing down on his chest. Meanwhile, Rick felt a growing conviction tightening in his gut. He remembered that performance years ago, the way the small crowd leaned closer when Keanu stepped forward to sing, the way his voice carried a grounded honesty that matched the rawness of grunge music. He remembered the rhythm of the bass, steady and controlled. It hadn't been flashy. It hadn't tried to impress. It had simply felt real. He watched Keanu from across the room again. The actor was still seated beside Jamie, showing no sign of the chaos that swirled around him. He leaned slightly toward her, offering calm reassurance, helping her breathe through the panic she didn't cause. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't bring attention to himself. He simply stayed present. Rick swallowed hard. That steadiness, that quiet confidence, that was what the show needed right now. He nudged another technician beside him, a younger colleague named Brian. Brian followed his gaze toward Keanu and let out a soft laugh in disbelief. But when Rick explained what he remembered, Brian's expression changed. He wasn't fully convinced, but he wasn't dismissing it either. Stress had a way of forcing people to consider the unexpected. Rick took a slow breath, debating what to do next. Approaching Marcus with such an idea felt risky. Marcus was already overwhelmed and barely holding the show together. Suggesting that the salvation of the centerpiece performance might come from a guest sitting quietly in the hallway could easily push him over the edge. But the clock was running out. They were past the point of safe solutions. Rick made up his mind. He stepped forward, weaving through clusters of frantic staff members. He passed the lighting crew huddled near a case of gels, the makeup team sitting in silence on the floor, and the nervous young musicians whispering anxiously about their uncertain fate. Every step he took felt heavier, as if the entire night rested on the message he was about to deliver. He found Marcus standing near the control room door, rubbing his temples as he stared at a clipboard cluttered with unusable notes. Marcus didn't notice Rick at first. His thoughts were spiraling through every failed plan. Rick cleared his throat gently. "Marcus," he said, keeping his voice as steady as he could, "I know you won't like this idea, but he can perform." Marcus lifted his head slowly, his exhausted eyes narrowing with confusion. Rick pointed toward the hallway, and Marcus stared at him like he had lost his mind. Marcus blinked hard, as if Rick's words didn't make sense in the chaos surrounding them. He glanced down the hallway toward Keanu, who was still seated beside Jamie, unaware of the storm he had suddenly been pulled into. Marcus let out a short, strained laugh, the kind that came from a man pushed far beyond exhaustion. "You're telling me," Marcus said, his voice hoarse, "that the solution to a collapsing live show is an actor sitting on a folding chair?" Rick didn't flinch. "Not just an actor, a musician. I've seen him perform. He can hold a stage, he can carry a song, and right now we don't have anyone else." Marcus pressed his hand against the wall to steady himself. The idea felt unreal, almost ridiculous. But the clock was merciless. The headliner wasn't coming back. Every backup plan had failed, and desperate moments demanded choices that would have sounded insane an hour earlier. He looked again at Keanu, watching how calmly he comforted Jamie while everyone else unraveled. Something about that grounded presence made Marcus hesitate. Maybe Rick wasn't losing his mind. Maybe he was the only one seeing clearly. Marcus inhaled slowly, feeling a dangerous hope stir. Marcus stood frozen after Rick's suggestion, staring down the hallway where Keanu sat with Jamie. The idea sounded impossible. It sounded reckless. It sounded like the kind of thing people joked about when they'd run out of real options. But tonight wasn't a joke. Tonight was collapsing around him, and the countdown clock wasn't slowing down for anyone. He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to swallow the disbelief tightening in his throat. He didn't want to drag a guest into this disaster. He didn't want to approach one of the most respected actors in the industry with a request that felt borderline absurd. He didn't want to risk insulting him, embarrassing him, or putting him in an impossible situation. But the show was slipping through his fingers, and every plan he had tried had already failed. Marcus took a shaky breath and stepped away from the control room door. Each step toward Keanu felt heavier than the last. He passed the makeup crew still sitting against the wall. He passed the anxious young musicians who watched him with worried eyes. He passed Rick, who stood rooted in place, silently urging him forward, even though he knew how insane this moment was. When Marcus finally reached Keanu, the actor looked up from where he sat beside Jamie. His expression was calm, almost gentle, as if he sensed the weight Marcus carried before a single word was spoken. "Keanu," Marcus said quietly, his voice cracking despite his effort to steady it. I need a moment, if you're willing." Jamie stepped aside, giving them space. Keanu nodded once, signaling he was listening. Marcus took another breath, but even speaking felt difficult. His throat tightened with embarrassment as he tried to explain the situation. He told Keanu about the headliner's sudden refusal, about the frantic calls, about the list of replacements that led nowhere. He didn't hide the crisis. He didn't sugarcoat the desperation. By the time he finished, his voice had gone hoarse, and he felt the weight of his confession hanging heavily between them. Keanu didn't interrupt him. He didn't shift uncomfortably or show signs of impatience. He simply listened with a steady, thoughtful attention that made Marcus's humiliation soften. When Marcus finally stopped talking, Keanu let the silence settle for a moment. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was a grounding one. Keanu glanced around the hallway, taking in the exhausted crew members, the frightened artists, the band members who looked as if they were moments away from walking out. He saw the fear in their eyes. He saw the helplessness. And then he looked back at Marcus, whose expression carried a mixture of apology and hope. "Marcus," Keanu said softly, "what exactly are you asking?" Marcus felt his stomach twist. Just hearing the question made his embarrassment deepen. "I don't know if this is fair," he admitted. "I don't know if it's even appropriate to ask you, but we're out of options. Someone remembered that you've performed before, that you've sung live, that you play bass." He swallowed hard. His next words were barely above a whisper. "I'm asking if you would consider stepping in. Not as a headliner, not as a celebrity appearance, just as someone who can help us keep the show from falling apart." The words hung between them for a moment, fragile and trembling with uncertainty. Marcus felt exposed, as if he had just asked the impossible from the one person who least deserved to be burdened by the chaos. He braced himself for a kind but firm refusal. He expected Keanu to smile apologetically or gently explain that he wasn't prepared, that it wasn't his place, that he didn't want to interfere with the show's lineup. But Keanu didn't respond right away. Instead, he let out a slow, thoughtful breath and looked down at his hands, resting on his knees. His posture didn't stiffen. His expression didn't turn defensive. He appeared to be processing the request with sincerity, weighing it carefully rather than dismissing it outright. Jamie watched quietly from a few feet away, her eyebrows lifting in cautious surprise. She could sense the magnitude of what Marcus was asking. Even the nearest crew members who pretended not to be listening stilled their movements as they strained to hear Keanu's response. Keanu lifted his gaze again, meeting Marcus's exhausted eyes with a calm clarity. "You're in a difficult spot," he said gently. "I can see that." His tone held no judgment, only understanding. Marcus let out a shaky exhale. "I'm asking for too much. I know that." Keanu shook his head. "You're asking because you care about your people. There's nothing wrong with that." The hallway quieted around them in a way that felt unintentional, but profound. Even the distant arguments near the stage door softened, as if the building itself knew something important was being decided. Keanu ran a hand through his hair and looked toward the stage entrance. The lights from the set spilled faintly into the hallway, casting long shadows across the walls. He thought about the young artists waiting for their first shot. He thought about the band members who had rehearsed for weeks with no one left to sing beside them. He thought about the crew who had worked since dawn, who stood now on the edge of losing everything to a disaster they didn't create. And he thought about Jamie, who was watching the grown world around her crumble under pressure. He didn't want to overshadow the younger musicians. He didn't want to become the story. He didn't want to step into the spotlight meant for someone else. But he also couldn't ignore the fear in the room. He turned back to Marcus, who seemed smaller now, as if the pressure had slowly folded him inward. "Marcus," Keanu said softly, "if you're asking whether I'll help, I need to know one thing. Would the rest of the team be comfortable with that?" "The band, the crew." "I'm not here to step on anyone's moment." Marcus blinked in surprise, not expecting such a grounded, considerate question. He straightened a little, feeling something inside his chest loosen. "If you agreed," he said, "I think you'd be giving everyone here a chance to breathe again." Keanu nodded slowly. His decision was forming not out of impulse, but out of compassion. He glanced toward Jamie, who watched him with wide, uncertain eyes. He offered her a reassuring smile, one meant to quiet her fear, rather than invite attention. Then he looked back at Marcus. "Let me put it this way," Keanu said in a calm, steady voice. "If everyone agrees, I'll help. I'm not a headliner, but I can help keep the stage lights on." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He stared at Keanu as if he hadn't heard correctly, as if the weight of those words had knocked the air out of him. He never expected a global star to offer something so humble, so simple, so human. Marcus felt his throat tighten as Keanu's words settled into the air. He hadn't expected agreement. He hadn't even expected consideration. He had walked into the conversation prepared for a gentle refusal, something polite enough to soften the blow of a failing broadcast. Instead, he stood staring at a man who was willing to shoulder pressure that wasn't his to carry. Keanu rose slowly from the folding chair, adjusting his jacket, as if preparing himself not for a performance, but for responsibility. There was no bravado in his movement, no excitement, no hint of ego. He looked almost apologetic, as if he wished there were a better solution than him stepping in. Jamie watched him with wide eyes, her nerves shifting into awe. She whispered his name almost as if checking that he was truly considering what they had just heard. Keanu offered her a soft smile that steadied her trembling hands. Marcus swallowed hard and nodded, still overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You're saving us." Keanu shook his head gently. "No, I'm helping. There's a difference." The distinction hit Marcus harder than he expected. It was so simple, yet so deeply true. Keanu wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't trying to rescue a failing broadcast. He was just trying to keep a room full of hard-working people from losing everything they had prepared for. Marcus exhaled shakily and finally allowed himself to hope. "I'll talk to the band," he said. "If they agree, We'll move forward." Keanu nodded. "Then let's see what they think." For the first time in nearly an hour, the chaos in Marcus's mind eased. He wasn't out of danger. The show wasn't saved, but for the first time tonight, there was a path forward. The band was waiting near the side entrance of the stage, clustered in a small semicircle that pulsed with frustration. Their instruments were tuned, their cables were coiled neatly, their monitors were set. They had been ready for over an hour, and now all that preparation meant nothing. The headliner was gone, the show was falling apart, and they felt useless while everything collapsed around them. The guitarist paced in small, irritated steps, running his fingers through his hair again and again until it stuck up at odd angles. The drummer sat on a crate with his elbows on his knees, drumsticks dangling loosely from his fingers. The pianist leaned against the wall, arms folded tightly across his chest. None of them had said a word in several minutes. Silence felt easier than admitting defeat. When Marcus approached, the tension in the group tightened instantly. They looked at him with tired eyes, expecting more bad news, expecting him to tell them their segment was cut, expecting their night to end in disappointment. Instead, Marcus hesitated, took a breath, and said something so unexpected that the drummer actually dropped one of his sticks. "We might have a replacement." The guitarist frowned. "Who?" "There's no one left." Marcus hesitated again. "Keanu Reeves." The pianist blinked hard, unsure whether Marcus was joking. Keanu Reeves, the guitarist, repeated slowly, as if testing the sound of the name. The actor Marcus nodded. The drummer let out a confused laugh. "You're serious?" Marcus didn't smile. "I'm out of options. He agreed to help if everyone is comfortable with it." For a moment, no one spoke. The silence wasn't dismissive. It was stunned. Rick stepped into the circle, wiping his hands on his jeans. "He has experience. I worked sound for him years ago in Los Angeles. He played bass. He sang. He was solid, and right now we don't need a star. We just need someone who can deliver something real." The guitarist looked skeptical. "Does he even know the material we rehearsed for a completely different arrangement?" Rick shook his head. "We picked something simple, something raw, something you can lock into fast." The pianist raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Rick hesitated. "An acoustic version of Creep, darker, grungier, minimal instrumentation, something with space for emotion." The band exchanged doubtful looks. The drummer tapped his stick lightly against his palm. "We could do that. It's not complicated." But the audience is expecting a headliner-level finale. Marcus's voice dropped into a weary honesty. Right now, the audience is expecting anything. As long as something happens on that stage, we have a chance. The band fell quiet again, processing the possibility. They were trained professionals, but asking them to perform with someone they had never rehearsed with felt like walking onto a tightrope blindfolded. Still, the tension in the air made it clear that refusing wasn't really an option. Finally, the drummer stood up slowly. "If he's willing, we're willing to try." The guitarist sighed. "Fine, but I want to hear him. No surprises on live broadcast." Marcus nodded. "That's fair." They followed him back toward the hallway where Keanu stood beside Jamie. He looked calm, grounded, almost impossibly steady for someone about to be asked to fill the spot of a major headliner. The band stopped a few feet away, studying him in silence. If this was going to work, they needed to see what he could do. Keanu noticed the group approaching their expressions, a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and exhaustion. He didn't change his posture or straighten up with confidence. He simply stood as he always did, quietly grounded. Jamie stayed beside him, clutching her guitar case, unsure of what was unfolding, but sensing how fragile the moment was. The guitarist cleared his throat first. "So," he said slowly, "you're willing to step in." Keanu nodded gently. "If it helps the team," he said, "but only if everyone is comfortable." The drummer looked him over, the way someone might inspect parachute straps before jumping out of a plane. "We need someone who can carry the final slot," he said. "It's not just a song, it's the song of the show." Keanu met the drummer's gaze without flinching. "I understand." The pianist crossed his arms. "What have you performed before?" "We're trying to understand what you're capable of with no rehearsal and almost no time." Keanu didn't brag or launch into his musical past. He simply shrugged lightly. I played with Dogstar. We performed in clubs, some small venues, some not so small. His tone was humble, almost apologetic. I'm not a headliner. I'm not trying to pretend I am. Rick stepped forward. He's telling the truth. I've mixed sound for him. He's steady, reliable. He doesn't oversing. He holds the rhythm. And right now, stability is what we need. The guitarist ran a hand through his hair, visibly torn between frustration and possibility. Fine, he said. But what song would you even perform? Rick answered before Keanu could speak. An acoustic, dark grunge, Creep. The band can pick it up fast. It doesn't need flash. It needs emotion. The drummer nodded slowly. We can work with that? The pianist exhaled. All right, but we need to hear something. Anything. Keanu gave a small nod of agreement. He didn't try to prepare an introduction. He didn't clear his throat dramatically. He simply accepted the bass that Rick handed him. The instrument fit naturally against him, as if it belonged there. He adjusted the strap, lightly testing the weight. The hallway quieted. Even people who weren't part of the conversation stopped what they were doing. They could feel something shifting. Keanu plucked a low note, warm and gritty at the same time. He adjusted the knobs on the borrowed amp, searching for a tone that felt honest. The guitarist tilted his head, surprised by how confident the touch was. The drummer leaned forward slightly, listening for rhythm. Jamie held her breath. Keanu hummed the intro quietly, almost under his breath, letting the progression settle in. His voice was soft, airy, more like a whisper carried by memory than a performance. The hallway grew impossibly still. Then, without build-up or theatrics, he sang 2 lines of the melody. His voice wasn't sharp or polished. It wasn't the kind of voice built for pop charts or engineered vocal runs. It was steady, low, raw, carried by a quiet power that felt heavier than the notes themselves. Every syllable landed with a grounded sincerity that no one expected. The guitarist froze, staring at him with an expression that shifted from skepticism into something closer to stunned respect. The drummer's eyebrows lifted. The pianist's arms dropped from his chest. Even crew members nearby stopped mid-stride. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't perfect. It was real. Exactly what the song needed. For several seconds after Keanu's final note faded, no one spoke. The air felt heavier, as if the hallway itself was absorbing the sound, replaying it back in a softer echo. The band exchanged glances that no longer held skepticism. Their faces carried a mixture of shock and recognition, the kind that came when something unexpected suddenly made perfect sense. The guitarist let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "All right," he said quietly. "Okay, that works." The drummer nodded slowly, tapping a soft rhythm against his thigh, as if already imagining the arrangement. "It's clean," he murmured. "Grounded. We can build around that." The pianist rubbed the back of his neck, visibly surprised. "I didn't expect that tone," he admitted. "It's not what the audience is used to, but maybe that's exactly why it'll hit harder." Rick folded his arms, satisfaction warming his expression. He had known what he heard all those years ago. Tonight only confirmed it. Marcus, who had been standing a few feet behind the band, felt his shoulders loosen for the first time since the crisis began. He watched Keanu lower the bass gently, not with the excitement of someone stepping into a spotlight, but with the humility of someone simply doing what needed to be done. Jamie's eyes shone with awe. She whispered that she had never heard him sing like that before. Keanu offered her a soft smile, one meant to reassure her rather than draw attention. The guitarist stepped forward. "If you're in," he said, "we're in." Keanu nodded once. "Then let's give them something honest." The band exchanged determined looks. The fear in the hallway didn't vanish, but it shifted, reshaped into something steadier, something possible. The stage wasn't saved yet, but for the first time tonight, it felt within reach. Jamie Rivera had been standing quietly near the hallway wall, still gripping her guitar case, as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. Everything around her felt unreal. The show she had imagined participating in for months, the orderly, exciting, once-in-a-lifetime experience, had twisted into chaos. Panic hung in the air like static electricity, and uncertainty seeped into every corner of the building. But then she watched something she never expected. Keanu Reeves, the man who had guided her through self-doubt, who had encouraged her to trust her voice, who had told her to breathe through fear, had just volunteered to take the biggest risk she had ever seen a performer take. And he had done it with no hesitation, no pride, no performative bravado. He had simply stepped in because others were hurting. Jamie watched as the band slowly accepted him, as Marcus began giving quiet instructions, as Rick adjusted mic settings with new purpose. The atmosphere shifted. People were still scared, but there was a thread of hope running through the tension, and that hope had come from one person who never wanted to be the center of attention. She stepped closer to Keanu, who was readjusting the bass strap around his shoulder. His movements were calm and deliberate. He didn't look nervous, even though Jamie knew he had every reason to be. No rehearsal, no warm-up, no safety net. Millions of people would be watching. The performance could either save the night or break it. Jamie swallowed hard, suddenly aware of her own trembling hands. She asked softly, "Are you nervous?" Keanu turned to her, and for a moment, it was just the two of them in the middle of a collapsing broadcast. His expression remained relaxed, but his eyes held a depth she had learned to recognize. He was thinking. He was honest. He was choosing his words carefully. "Everyone feels fear," he said gently. "What matters is what we do with it." Something in Jamie's chest loosened, as if those words had reached a place too deep for breath alone. She stared at him, stunned. She knew he wasn't speaking like an actor reciting lines. He wasn't trying to sound wise. He wasn't trying to teach her a lesson. He was simply telling the truth as he had lived it. Fear didn't stop him. Fear didn't define him. Fear wasn't a wall, it was a doorway. Jamie felt her breath shift, falling into a steadier rhythm. She looked at the stage beyond the hallway entrance and imagined herself standing there. For the first time tonight, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel unprepared. She didn't feel like an outsider waiting for permission to belong. She felt inspired. Watching Keanu step into the most unpredictable moment of his career made her realize something she had never fully understood. Bravery didn't always roar. It didn't always come with applause or bright lights. Sometimes bravery looked like a quiet person choosing to help when the world was falling apart around them. Sometimes bravery looked exactly like this. Jamie hugged her guitar case and whispered to herself, "This night is going to change everything." She didn't know how yet, but she felt it. She knew it. Jamie stayed close enough to observe, but far enough not to interfere as the hallway shifted into a new rhythm. The band members tested their instruments with renewed focus. Rick fine-tuned the mic levels, making small adjustments while glancing toward Keanu for confirmation. Marcus spoke quickly but calmly now, organizing cues and rerouting the final minutes of the show. What had been panic just moments earlier was now a fragile hope taking shape, and the source of that hope stood only a few feet from her. Keanu rested the bass against his hip, gently tapping the strings with his fingertips to feel their response. Jamie watched him closely. He moved with a quiet certainty she had never seen up close. There was no swagger, no push to appear impressive. Everything he did came from intention and sincerity. It reminded her of the way he had encouraged her in rehearsal, urging her to trust her song, her breath, her story. Now he was modeling that same courage in real time. Jamie noticed something else too. The crew, who had once rushed past with frantic energy, were beginning to slow near him. Not to interrupt, not to stare, but to take a breath. His presence alone seemed to calm them. A lighting tech paused beside him for a moment, shoulders relaxing. One of the younger camera operators exhaled shakily and wiped his eyes, grounding himself before returning to his station. It stunned Jamie to realize that Keanu wasn't just stepping in to perform a song. He was steadying an entire room of people who felt like they had been pushed to the edge. She stepped closer, watching his hands glide across the fretboard as he rehearsed the progression quietly. His touch was gentle, but precise. She could hear faint notes unamplified, blending softly with the distant hum of the studio. It reminded her of the rare moments in rehearsal when she let her emotions guide her instead of her fear. Jamie hesitated, then asked, "How do you stay so calm?" Keanu gave a small smile. "I don't," he said. "I just try to stay present. Panic pulls us into the future. Regret pulls us into the past. Being here. He lightly plucked a string keeps us steady." Jamie felt the words settle into her like an anchor. She had spent years battling stage fright, swallowing the fear that rose inside her whenever an audience gathered. But she had never learned to confront it this way. To acknowledge it, but not obey it. To feel it, but not let it dictate her movement. As Keanu adjusted the strap again, she noticed a slight tremor in his hand. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the weight of responsibility. He wasn't immune to the pressure. He simply refused to let it control him. And knowing that made him even more human. Rick called out a question about the tempo, and Keanu answered while gently tapping the beat against his thigh. Jamie watched him shift effortlessly between conversation and preparation. There was no frantic energy, no racing breath. Just focus, just clarity. She realized she was watching the same person who had told her earlier that bravery wasn't the absence of fear. It was the choice to keep going despite it. In that moment, Jamie understood something she had never been taught in any music class or performance workshop. This was courage, quiet, steady, humble, alive, and she promised herself she would never forget this night. The preparation continued around them, but Jamie kept her eyes on Keanu, feeling something inside her shift in a way she couldn't fully explain. Moments ago, she had felt like a nervous newcomer, lost in a storm too big to understand. Now she felt as if she were witnessing a masterclass in composure, not taught through lectures or instructions, but through action. Keanu tightened the bass strap and stepped closer to the stage entrance. The glow from the overhead lights softened his features, revealing a focus she had never seen before. Not fierce, not intense, but deeply grounded. It was the kind of focus that came from acceptance rather than control. Jamie moved toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said, "for doing this." Keanu looked at her with gentle eyes. "Tonight isn't about being perfect," he said. "It's about showing up when people need you. You did that today too." Jamie felt a warmth bloom in her chest. No one had ever told her she had shown up for anything. She had spent so much of her life trying to avoid mistakes that she never noticed the courage it took simply to stand on a stage and try. He added softly, "This moment is teaching all of us something, even me." Jamie breathed in slowly, letting those words settle. She realized the night wasn't just changing him or the show, it was changing her. She wasn't watching a star perform, she was watching a human being choose to rise when everything around him was falling. And through him she understood a truth she wanted to carry with her forever. Courage doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it stands quietly in a hallway holding a bass guitar. Sometimes it looks exactly like the mentor she trusted. The closer Keanu moved toward the stage entrance, the more the atmosphere changed around him. The hallway, once filled with frantic footsteps and raised voices, now carried a heavy, charged stillness. It was the kind of quiet that appeared only after a storm had spent itself, leaving people shaken and waiting for whatever came next. The band followed him closely, and their instruments in hand, their expressions tense but determined. They were stepping into unfamiliar territory, but the small glimpse of Keanu's voice earlier had given them something to hold on to. Rick lingered behind them, adjusting one last cable, while Marcus communicated with the director through a headset, trying to rebuild the show's final cues on the fly. Jamie watched from the wings, her fingers pressed lightly against the frame of the doorway. She had never seen a stage look so intimidating, yet so fragile. The lights overhead began to shift into their pre-show patterns, casting soft sweeps of color across the empty space where the headliner should have stood. Every moving light beam seemed to search the floor for the star who had refused to go on. Keanu stepped out just far enough to see the studio audience. Their murmurs filled the room in an uncertain wave. They knew something was wrong. They could feel it. The final set was minutes away, yet the stage remained dark, except for the dim rehearsal lights. The anticipation in the crowd had begun curdling into confusion. The director standing in the control booth wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. He stared through the glass pane at Keanu, unsure whether this moment represented brilliance collapse or something in between. The network executive beside him leaned forward with narrowed eyes, arms folded tightly, wanting answers no one could give. Keanu didn't let the pressure change his breathing. He took in the room, the crowd, the unfinished energy pulsing through the air, and then he turned to Marcus. "No spotlight," Keanu said quietly. "Keep it simple." Marcus hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He relayed the instruction through his headset. The lighting operator paused mid-adjustment, surprised, then slowly dimmed the rig down to a soft, neutral wash. Without spotlights cutting across his silhouette, Keanu looked less like a movie icon stepping onto a grand stage, and more like an ordinary man with a bass guitar ready to do what needed to be done. That was the point. Keanu walked toward the front microphone. His steps were steady, almost meditative. The bass hung calmly in his hands, its weight familiar against him. He positioned himself at the mic, exhaling softly as he settled into place. 9 minutes until live. The band members took their positions around him. The drummer rolled his shoulders, shaking out tension. The guitarist gave his strings a quiet tuning check. The pianist sat forward, hands hovering just above the keys. None of them spoke. They all felt the same thing: pressure, fear, and a strange sense of unity born from necessity. Rick made a final sound check, adjustment raising the bass input slightly. Marcus glanced at the countdown screen again. Time was bleeding away, 5 minutes until live. The stage manager's voice cracked through the comms system, trembling slightly as she announced the time. She stood at the edge of the curtain with a clipboard clutched to her chest, tapping her foot without realizing it. Her eyes darted between the countdown monitor and Keanu as if waiting for some sign that everything would be all right. The band continued their silent preparation. The guitarist tested the opening progression under his breath, barely touching the strings. The drummer kept his sticks resting across his knees, tapping a slow, steady rhythm to anchor his nerves. The pianist inhaled deeply, rolling his fingers gently down the keys without pressing them. They were ready in their own way, tense but ready. Jamie stood at the far wing, gripping the curtain so tightly her knuckles ached. She watched Keanu shift his weight, settle his stance, and adjust the bass strap one final time. She felt her pulse rising, not from her own fear now, but from the enormity of what he was about to do. She whispered a quiet prayer he would never hear, hoping the moment would hold together for him. 4 minutes until live. The director leaned toward the glass again, eyes locked on Keanu's figure. He didn't speak. There were no more instructions to give. The broadcast was now balancing between disaster and salvation, and all he could do was trust the man standing alone at the microphone. The network executive pressed one hand against the desk, his jaw tight. He had seen years of rehearsed perfection, polished acts and carefully curated faces built for television. But this raw, unscripted, unpredictable moment was something he could not predict or control. It terrified him more than any ratings chart ever had. 3 minutes until live. Keanu lowered his head for a moment, not in prayer, not in hesitation, but in grounding. He inhaled deeply, letting the sound of the quiet auditorium wash over him. He listened for the subtle noises, the shifting of audience members, the hum of the speakers, the low whispers of crew members checking final details. All of it reminded him that despite the chaos, the world kept moving. 2 minutes until live. The stage manager swallowed hard. Her voice shook as she announced the time once more. 2 minutes. Stand by. Everything went quiet. The kind of quiet that touches the edges of fear. The kind of quiet that magnifies every breath. Jamie stepped forward slightly, not wanting to interrupt, but wanting to be closer. She felt every beat of the moment as if it were happening inside her chest. Keanu lifted his head and looked out toward the audience again. No spotlight, no theatrics, just the soft wash of overhead lights and a room full of people who had no idea what was about to happen. He placed his fingers on the bass strings, testing the weight of the moment through the instrument. 1 minute until live. Marcus stepped back, his heart pounding. 30 seconds. The red light above the main camera blinked to life. 10 seconds. The entire studio held its breath. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The broadcast went live. The moment the red broadcasting light blinked on, a ripple passed through the studio. The audience straightened in their seats, expecting the headliner to emerge through the fog or burst onto the stage in a dramatic entrance. Instead, they saw something entirely unexpected. Keanu Reeves stood alone at the front microphone, the bass resting against him like an old friend. No spotlight carved through the air, no elaborate lighting washed over him, just a soft, steady glow that kept him grounded, human, imperfect, in the best possible way. A murmur swept through the crowd, a mixture of confusion and surprise. Some people leaned forward as if trying to determine whether this was a technical error. Others glanced at the stage monitors overhead, expecting the real performer to appear at any moment. Even the home audience watching from couches, kitchens, and phones felt the shift in tone before a single note played. Keanu inhaled slowly. His fingers pressed gently into the bass strings. The band behind him waited poised, listening for his lead. And then he plucked the first note. It was soft, but resonant, vibrating through the speakers with a warm, gritty depth that caught the attention of even the most skeptical viewer. The auditorium quieted instantly. Gasps echoed across the front rows as people realized this wasn't a cameo or a scripted joke. This was the performance. Keanu leaned into the microphone, his voice emerging low and raw, carrying a broken honesty that felt more like a confession than a song. The dark grunge arrangement wrapped around him like a shadow, giving the familiar melody a haunting texture that pulsed through the room. It wasn't polished, it wasn't theatrical, but it was true, painfully, beautifully true. As he sang the first lines, the camera operator instinctively nudged the lens closer. The director in the control booth took a sharp breath, pointing at the screen, urging his team to stay with the close-up. The camera zoomed slowly toward Keanu's face, catching the steady intensity in his eyes. They weren't acting. They weren't performing in the Hollywood sense. They were remembering, feeling, carrying decades of live moments into every syllable. When he reached the quiet confession, "I'm a creep," the audience reacted in unison. A wave of emotion passed through them. Some people stared in disbelief, unable to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the sound filling the studio. Others felt tears forming without fully understanding why. The vulnerability in his tone hit something tender and unguarded in them. Jamie watched from the wing, her breath caught in her throat. She had never heard him sing like this, never heard this particular mix of fragility and strength coexisting so powerfully. It felt like the whole room had slowed down to match the rhythm of his voice. Even the crew members who had worked frantically all night stood frozen, drawn into the gravity of the moment. The band followed Keanu's lead seamlessly. The guitarist strummed gently, letting the chords float behind the vocal line without overpowering it. The drummer added a muted, steady beat, anchoring the mood without breaking its intimacy. The pianist added soft, melancholic notes that felt like distant echoes of something forgotten. This wasn't the performance the audience expected, but it was the performance they would remember. Keanu continued through the next lines with a quiet intensity that drew every eye toward him. His voice didn't rise or strain. It didn't reach for attention. Instead, it carried the weight of someone who had lived through enough storms to understand what brokenness sounded like. The rawness in his tone didn't weaken the performance. It strengthened it. Every note felt unfiltered and painfully real. The studio audience reacted instinctively. A few people pressed their hands to their mouths in shock. Others leaned forward in their seats, caught between awe and disbelief. This wasn't what anyone had expected from the final segment of a national broadcast show, yet no one in the room wanted it to end. The camera operator zoomed in again, this time catching the faint wrinkle at the corner of Keanu's eyes as he delivered the next verse. His expression remained controlled, but there was something behind it, something human, fragile, reflective. It wasn't a performance crafted for entertainment. It was a man opening a small window into his own experience. The sound engineer in the booth lowered his clipboard slowly, his eyes fixed on the audio levels. He whispered to the director, "He's not performing the song. He's telling it." The director didn't respond. He didn't have words for what he was seeing. The guitarist relaxed into the rhythm, matching Keanu's emotional cadence. His strumming softened almost as if he were afraid to intrude on the moment. The drummer followed, adding pulse-like taps that barely broke the silence, while the pianist layered each chord with a faint echo of melancholy. They had gone from skeptics to witnesses. Now they were participants in something none of them had expected. As the chorus approached, Keanu's voice dipped even lower. His breath created a soft rasp that carried through the speakers like an unspoken truth. It made the lyrics feel heavier, more vulnerable. The crowd began to sway in gentle rhythm, not because the arrangement demanded it, but because they were emotionally pulled into the current of the performance. Jamie stood frozen backstage, her hand pressed to her heart. She felt the same trembling awe she had felt during rehearsal, but magnified 100-fold. She had always believed music needed technical perfection to move people. Tonight proved the opposite. It needed honesty. It needed humanity. Keanu was giving both without holding anything back. In the control booth, the network executive slowly lowered himself into a chair, eyes locked on the monitor. "What is happening?" he whispered, not to anyone in particular. He had rarely seen a moment on live television feel this raw and unmanufactured. The audience remained silent, except for the occasional gasp. The room felt suspended, as if nothing existed outside the studio walls. Every note Keanu played created a ripple that traveled through the crowd, softening even the most unmoved faces. The band trusted him completely now. They followed his lead with absolute focus, shaping their sound around the emotions flowing from his voice. Something was happening on that stage, something unplanned, something unforgettable. Halfway through the song, something shifted in the studio so quietly that no one recognized it at first. It wasn't a dramatic change, it wasn't a burst of applause or an unexpected note. It was a deep collective stillness, the kind that arrives only when every person in a room is feeling something they cannot describe. The audience stopped moving. Their breathing softened. 1,000 eyes stayed locked on Keanu, as if afraid that the slightest sound might break the fragile spell forming around them. Even those who had come only for entertainment felt the shift. They felt the vulnerability in the room rise like a tide. Keanu sang the next lines with a calm intensity that wrapped around the studio like a quiet storm. His eyes remained steady, fixed not on the camera or the audience, but somewhere inward, as if pulling emotion from a place he rarely allowed others to see. The soft wash of lighting made him almost appear part of the shadows, giving the performance an intimate rawness that large stages rarely capture. Backstage, Jamie watched with her hands pressed to her mouth, tears forming before she realized she was crying. Her heart felt full and trembling at the same time. She had rehearsed dozens of songs in her life, but she had never seen a moment like this, never seen an entire room fall silent out of pure respect. Rick stood beside her, one hand resting on a coil of cables he had forgotten he was holding. His usual quick-thinking focus had slowed into awe. He whispered something under his breath, a quiet expression of disbelief, but even he didn't look away from the stage. Crew members who had been running earlier, scrambling under pressure, now stood frozen in half-completed motions. A young assistant held a stack of cue cards, but didn't move to hand them off. A lighting tech kept one hand on a dimmer lever, but didn't adjust it. The chaos that had overtaken the building only minutes ago had melted into a profound, reflective quiet. Inside the control room, Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, not tension, something deeper. He had spent 20 years directing live television, collecting awards, orchestrating flawless productions, yet nothing he had ever worked on felt like this. The screens in front of him glowed softly, capturing Keanu's face, the shadows under his eyes, the gritty depth in his voice. Marcus leaned forward without realizing it, drawn into the moment like everyone else. The network executive beside him watched silently, his usual strict expression softening. He wasn't thinking about ratings or contracts. He wasn't thinking about the ruined headliner segment. He was thinking about how still the room had become, and how he, a man who prided himself on emotional distance, was now struggling to swallow the lump forming in his throat. Keanu reached the midpoint of the song, letting the final line of the verse fall gently into the air. The sound hung there, suspended, among the lights before dissolving into a silence so deep it felt sacred. For a heartbeat, no one breathed, and for the first time all night, that silence wasn't frightening. It was beautiful. The silence lingered for only a breath before Keanu lifted his eyes again, preparing for the final chorus. Something in his posture shifted, not bigger, not louder, but deeper. The band sensed it instantly. The guitarist softened his strumming, letting each chord breathe. The drummer tapped the snare with a gentleness that felt like a heartbeat. The pianist added fragile notes that floated beneath the melody like drifting shadows. Keanu leaned slightly into the microphone, inhaling slowly, as if drawing in the weight of every person watching him. Then he began the final chorus. His voice came out different this time. Still low, still raw, but fuller. There was an ache in it, a quiet strength shaped by years of carrying memories he rarely spoke about. Every word sounded lived in. Every note trembled with humanity. The audience felt it immediately. Some clasped their hands together. Others wiped their eyes. A few simply stared, unable to reconcile the humility of the man on stage with the emotional power filling the room. Jamie felt tears spill down her cheeks. She didn't bother wiping them. She wanted to absorb every second of this moment, to learn from it, to carry it with her for the rest of her life. She understood now that courage could feel soft. Courage could feel quiet. Courage could change a room without raising its voice. Keanu reached the final line of the song. His voice cracked not from strain, but from truth. The crack made the lyrics even more real, a reminder that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but connection. The note faded into the dim lights and drifted upward into the rafters. For a moment, the studio remained frozen. Then the first person stood up. It was a woman near the center of the audience, rising slowly, with both hands pressed to her chest. Another stood beside her, then another and another. The movement spread like a wave, sweeping across the entire room until every single person in the studio was on their feet. Applause erupted, not polite clapping, not casual appreciation, but a thunderous, emotional release that shook the air and rolled through the stage like a physical force. The cheers rose higher, echoing off the walls, growing in intensity as people realized what they had just witnessed. Some shouted his name, others covered their faces, overwhelmed. Many simply clapped with everything they had, trying to communicate gratitude in the only way they could. The ovation didn't end. It kept going and going. Nearly 2 minutes of non-stop applause. Keanu didn't bask in it. He didn't lift his arms, didn't grin, didn't play to the cameras. He lowered his base slowly and bowed his head, offering a soft, humble smile. The kind of smile that said he wasn't celebrating a triumph. He was simply grateful the room had found something meaningful in the music. Marcus stood frozen in the control room, unable to speak. Rick blinked hard to keep from tearing up. Jamie pressed a hand to her heart again, feeling it pound with a mix of pride and disbelief. The studio had erupted. But Keanu remained grounded, steady, humble, exactly as he always was. The final notes of applause were still echoing faintly in the rafters when the broadcast cut to commercial. The studio lights shifted back to their neutral glow, and the red recording signal blinked off. For a moment, the room remained in a stunned, breathless silence, as if no one wanted to move too quickly and break the lingering energy of what had just happened. Then everything exploded into motion. Marcus practically tore off his headset as he sprinted down the hallway toward the backstage curtain. He didn't wait for the director's closing comments or the network executive's reaction. None of that mattered. All he could focus on was the single fact pulsing through his mind: the night had been saved, and it was because one man stepped forward when no one else could. Keanu had barely set his bass down when Marcus reached him. Without hesitation, Marcus wrapped his arms around him in a tight, overwhelmed hug. It wasn't polished or professional. It was raw gratitude, the kind that breaks through every barrier. "Thank you," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. "You saved us. I mean it." "You saved the whole show." Keanu returned the embrace, gently patting Marcus's shoulder with quiet modesty. "I just helped," he said softly. "Everyone here worked hard. I was just a random person here today." But Marcus shook his head, unable to accept that. "No, you were the reason we didn't fall apart. You were the anchor tonight." Before Keanu could respond, the band members rushed in next. The guitarist slapped his shoulder with wide-eyed admiration. The drummer laughed in disbelief. The pianist grinned, still shaking his head like he hadn't fully processed what just happened. "Man, that was unreal," the guitarist said. "You didn't just fill the slot, you transformed it. You carried us," the pianist added. Keanu smiled humbly, hands in his pockets. "You all followed beautifully. It was a team moment." Rick stepped forward last. He looked like he hadn't blinked in minutes. His eyes were glassy, his throat tight, his usual workplace toughness stripped away. He brushed a hand over his cheek, wiping a tear quickly. "I knew you had it," he managed to say. "But I didn't know you had that." Keanu raised an eyebrow. That honesty," Rick said. "That rawness. You didn't perform the song. You lived it. Everyone felt it." Keanu looked slightly embarrassed by the praise. "I was just doing what the moment needed." Jamie moved toward him slowly, her steps soft, her eyes shining with awe. She felt as if she'd watched someone leap off a cliff and land with grace that seemed impossible. Keanu caught her gaze, offering her the warm, grounding smile that had steadied her all night. "You okay?" he asked gently. Jamie nodded, still breathless. "I don't think I'll ever forget that." Crew members gathered around them, whispering, smiling, exchanging looks of disbelief. Some reached out to shake Keanu's hand. Others simply stood back, watching with gratitude etched on their faces. He kept saying the same thing to each one: "I was just a random person here today. It wasn't me, it was the team. I just filled a spot." But everyone around him knew it wasn't true. He saved the show, he saved the jobs, he saved the night. Keanu tried to step away from the crowd, hoping to give the band and crew room to celebrate their own resilience, but people kept approaching him. Every face around him carried the same astonished gratitude, as if they were seeing not a celebrity, but a lifeline they hadn't expected to find. A young lighting assistant hurried forward, visibly nervous. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you. I thought we were all going to lose our jobs tonight. What you did, it meant a lot." Keanu shook his head gently. "You kept the light steady. That mattered just as much." The assistant blinked, surprised by the humility, then nodded with shaky appreciation before stepping aside. Next came two camera operators who had spent the first half of the evening preparing for disaster coverage. Now, they stood before him almost shyly, as if embarrassed they had ever doubted what the night could become. One said, "You changed the whole energy out there. I don't think any of us have ever felt a room shift like that." Keanu offered a soft smile. "Music does that, and you all held the moment beautifully." Even the stage manager, who had spent the evening trembling between panic and responsibility, approached him with watery eyes. "I've worked backstage for 15 years, she said quietly, "and I've never seen an audience respond like that. You turned a crisis into something unforgettable." Keanu's voice remained gentle. "You kept everything running. You guided us in. I just followed your lead." Meanwhile, Marcus stood to the side, watching the interactions with a mix of pride and disbelief. He couldn't shake the memory of his earlier fear, how he had expected everything to collapse, how he had felt helpless with the countdown ticking mercilessly toward disaster. Now, seeing the crew celebrating, seeing relief, wash over the building, the weight on his shoulders finally loosened. He approached Keanu again, this time slower, more deliberate. "I know you'll keep saying you were just here," Marcus said softly, "but I need you to understand something. People came to this job tonight scared of losing what they love. You didn't just save a show. You protected their work, their passion, their dignity." Keanu looked humbled, his eyes softening. "I didn't want anyone to be hurt by something they couldn't control." "And that," Marcus replied, voice thick with sincerity, "is exactly why everyone is thanking you." Jamie stepped closer, staying within the circle of warmth created by the lingering energy of the performance. She looked up at Keanu, not as a mentor now, but as someone whose courage had taught her more in one night than years of training ever could. "You said fear isn't the problem," she whispered. "It's what we do with it." Keanu nodded gently. "Tonight we did something with it." Around them, the crew laughed, cried, and celebrated the impossible turnaround of the night. And though Keanu tried to fade quietly back into the background, everyone knew the truth. He wasn't just a random person here today. He was the reason the building was still filled with hope. As the backstage celebration settled into pockets of laughter and relieved conversation, Jamie stood a few steps away from the crowd, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her heart was still racing, not from fear now, but from the overwhelming mix of emotions swirling inside her. She watched Keanu greet each crew member with kindness, offering small nods of gratitude, deflecting praise with gentle humility. Even after saving the entire show, he remained grounded, blending into the group as if he had been just another technician or session musician filling a spot. Jamie knew she needed to speak to him. She felt something inside her pushing forward, urging her to take this moment before it slipped into memory. Her throat tightened as she walked toward him, feeling the weight of what she wanted to say. Keanu noticed her before she reached him and turned slightly, giving her his full attention. His expression softened, as if he sensed her nerves. "Hey, Jamie," he said quietly. "You okay?" Jamie's voice wavered. I think so." She paused, swallowing hard as tears threatened to rise. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Keanu nodded and stepped a little away from the crowd so she wouldn't feel watched. "Of course." The hallway felt quieter here, still filled with the hum of equipment and distant voices, but muted enough for her to breathe. Jamie took a deep breath. "I finally understand," she said softly. Keanu tilted his head. "Understand what?" "What you meant," Jamie replied, her voice shaking. "About performing with heart instead of fear. About letting the song carry you instead of trying to control everything." Her eyes shimmered. "Watching you tonight, something changed in me. I didn't know music could feel like that. I didn't know I could feel like that." Keanu listened without interrupting. His presence alone steadied her. "I kept thinking I had to be perfect," she continued, "that if I messed up, people would judge me or think I didn't belong. But when you stepped onto that stage with almost no preparation, you weren't trying to be perfect. You were just honest. You gave everything you had in the moment, and it moved all of us." Jamie wiped her cheek, surprised by the tears. "You weren't singing to impress. You were singing to connect, and that's what made it powerful." Keanu looked down for a moment, humbled by her words. "Thank you," he said softly. "But tonight wasn't about me. It was about everyone realizing what they're capable of when the moment calls for it." Jamie shook her head gently. "But you showed us how to face that moment." Keanu met her eyes with a calm sincerity. "Jamie, the courage you felt tonight that wasn't borrowed from me, it was already inside you. Sometimes we just need a spark to see it." She breathed out a trembling laugh, feeling the truth in his words. "It felt like something opened up," she whispered, "like I finally understand what it means to perform." Keanu placed a warm hand on her shoulder. "Then take that with you. Let it guide you forward." Jamie nodded slowly, letting the emotions settle into resolve. Her fear hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled her. Something stronger stood in its place. Tonight had changed her, and she wasn't going back. Jamie let out a slow breath as Keanu's words settled deeper into her. For so long she had believed courage belonged to other people, to the seasoned artists, to the confident performers, to those who never let their hands shake when they stepped onto a stage. But tonight had shown her a different version of courage, a version that looked more like honesty than perfection. She wiped her eyes again and laughed softly. "I was terrified earlier," she admitted. "I kept thinking I wasn't ready for a place like this. And then everything went wrong tonight. Everything. And instead of falling apart, you stepped forward." Keanu shook his head gently. "Stepping forward doesn't mean you aren't afraid. It just means you care more about the people depending on you than the fear trying to stop you." Jamie felt a warmth building in her chest. "I want to do that too," she whispered. "Not just for others, but for myself. I don't want fear deciding who I get to be." Keanu's expression softened with quiet pride. "You already took your first step the moment you walked into this building. You showed up, you tried, and that matters." Jamie looked down at her hands, seeing them differently now. They weren't weak or unprepared. They were capable. They were learning. They were growing. She lifted her gaze again. "I want to perform again," she said, steadier. "This time. Not just rehearse, not hide behind excuses. I want to get back on stage stronger than ever." Keanu smiled a small, warm curve of encouragement. "Then that's exactly what you should do." She felt her voice grow firmer. "Tonight made me realize I've been measuring myself by all the wrong things. I kept chasing perfection when what I should have been chasing was connection. The way the audience responded to you, it wasn't because everything was flawless, it was because everything was real." Keanu nodded. "People feel honesty. It's universal. It doesn't need polish, it just needs heart." Jamie looked around the hallway, the cables on the ground, the equipment cases, the exhausted but smiling crew. The atmosphere was different now, softer, fuller. The tension had melted into gratitude, and she felt herself becoming part of it, rather than standing outside looking in. "I want to grow into an artist who can do that," she said. "Who can make people feel something real." "You will," Keanu replied, "because you're not running from the hard moments anymore." Jamie paused, letting his words anchor her. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For showing me what courage looks like. For reminding me that fear isn't the enemy." Keanu placed a gentle hand over hers. "Fear tells us we care. What matters is choosing what we do next." Jamie nodded with confidence she hadn't felt in years. "What I'm choosing next," she said, "is to keep going." Keanu gave her a soft smile. "That's the only way progress ever happens." She exhaled, feeling stronger, lighter, transformed. Tonight had started as a nightmare, but it had become the moment she finally found her voice. Long after the applause faded and the crew finished packing equipment, Marcus Hale found himself sitting alone in his small office at the back of the studio. The clock on the wall ticked softly, reminding him how long the night had stretched. The building had grown quiet, but his mind had not. He sat in front of his laptop, hands hovering over the keyboard, unsure how to begin the message he owed the network. He rubbed his tired eyes and leaned back in his chair, replaying the events of the evening. He had never experienced anything like it. In all his years as a producer, through missed cues, malfunctioning lights, last-minute rewrites, and tense negotiations, he had always managed to keep the show alive through structure and planning. But tonight, everything had collapsed. Every safety net had torn at the same time, and just when he believed the broadcast was about to become the worst moment of his career, something unexpected happened. A single act of humility walked onto the stage with a bass guitar. Marcus exhaled deeply, trying to gather the right words. Finally, he began typing. "To the network team, I want to address tonight's broadcast." He paused again. How could he possibly summarize what had unfolded? How could he explain that the scheduled headliner walked out less than an hour before air? That the crew was seconds from falling apart under pressure, that fear had gripped every corner of the building. And then, that Keanu Reeves, a man who had no obligation to the show, stepped in quietly, not to save the day, not for attention, not for recognition, but simply because people needed help. Marcus continued typing, trying to keep the message professional, but sincerity kept seeping into his words. "I want to acknowledge the chaos that preceded the final performance. Our team faced an unexpected crisis, Emotions were high. Mistakes were made. But I also want to emphasize how our night was saved not by contingency plans, but by a moment of human generosity. He stopped again, staring at the screen. The word generosity felt too small. What Keanu had done was more than that. It wasn't a grand gesture or a heroic stunt. It was something quieter, something more powerful. It was the willingness to step into fear with humility, offering calm when others were drowning. Marcus leaned forward, typing again. I witnessed tonight what real leadership looks like. Keanu didn't ask for lights. He didn't ask for rehearsals or introductions. He didn't ask for credit. He simply said, if everyone agrees, I'll help. I don't know how many people watching at home understood the weight of that moment. But I did. We all did. He let the sentence rest there. His chest tightened with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel earlier. He remembered the panic in the crew's eyes, the director's trembling hands, the young artists who thought their big night was unraveling beyond repair. He remembered how close he came to losing control of the entire production, and he remembered how everything shifted the moment Keanu stepped forward. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Tonight had shown him something uncomfortable but necessary. Fear had nearly destroyed them. Not the crisis, not the headliner's walkout. Fear. And fear was something he could control. He continued typing. I owe you a full report, but before that I want to make one thing clear. I've learned something important about how I lead this team. He paused, letting the truth settle inside him. Tonight had changed him too. Marcus continued typing, fingers moving slowly but with growing certainty. I realized tonight that I have been leading from a place of pressure instead of humanity. I push this team hard. I demand precision. I chase perfection because I fear failure. But fear nearly broke all of us tonight. It made me forget the people behind the job titles. He sat back and read the sentence twice. It felt raw, unpolished, but it was honest. And honesty was the only way to capture what tonight had taught him. Marcus thought of the makeup crew sitting on the floor earlier, waiting for instructions they weren't sure would ever come. He thought of the camera operators who braced themselves for a catastrophic broadcast. He remembered the stage manager's trembling voice, the band's uncertainty, the assistants who ran themselves breathless, trying to fix problems they didn't create. He had seen their fear. He had contributed to their fear. And it hurt to admit that. He returned to the keyboard. I owe my staff an apology, not for the crisis, we couldn't control that, but for the way fear took hold of us. I watched people doubt themselves because they thought one mistake would end everything. That's not who I want to be as a leader. Marcus swallowed hard. He thought again of the moment Keanu walked toward the stage base in hand, steady as ever. There was no spotlight, no dramatic entrance, just a man choosing courage over comfort, humility over pride. He typed again. What struck me most was how someone so famous, someone with so much to lose, chose to do something simple and human. No headlines, no ego, no negotiations, just help. I am still moved by the thought of it. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the email draft. The room felt quieter now, as if the building itself were listening. I don't know how many viewers understood the significance of what they saw. Most of them probably had no idea the headliner walked out. They probably didn't know the performance was improvised, but they felt something real, something honest. And I believe that matters more than perfection ever could. Marcus read the draft one more time, then added a final thought. I will be leading differently tomorrow, with more compassion, with more patience, with more trust in the people who make these shows possible. He saved the draft, letting out a slow, steady breath. Tonight wasn't only saved, it had changed him. By the time the crew finished cleaning cables and shutting down monitors, the world outside the studio was already erupting. The performance had aired only minutes earlier, but social media platforms were exploding with reactions. People who had been watching casually from their living rooms now sat stunned on couches, phones glowing in their hands, replaying the unexpected moment that had shaken them. Clips of the performance spread fast, cut and re-uploaded by viewers who couldn't believe what they had witnessed. The videos showed the dimly lit stage, the quiet tension, the haunting arrangement, and Keanu Reeves standing at the microphone with nothing but a bass, a soft wash of neutral lights, and a voice full of raw honesty. No theatrics, no spotlight, no fanfare. One comment on a live stream replay read, "I thought this was going to be a joke cameo." But then he opened his mouth, and I felt that in my chest. Another said, "You can't fake that kind of emotion. That wasn't a performance, that was something real." A third person wrote, "I've heard 100 covers of Creep. None hit me like this one. It was like he was telling a story with every note." Within an hour, the hashtags related to the show climbed trending charts. People who had missed the broadcast rushed to find the clip everyone was talking about. Music forums lit up with threads titled, "Did anyone just see Keanu Reeves on live TV? And that might be the most emotional version of Creep ever recorded." Some viewers discussed the raw tone of his voice. Others focused on the vulnerability in his expression. A few admitted they had cried without knowing why. But all of them shared the same sentiment. The moment felt unfiltered in a world that had become too polished. Even viewers on the opposite side of the emotional spectrum felt something shift inside them. One wrote, "I thought celebrity performances were all hype. But tonight, something felt different." And yet, as thousands of users refreshed their feeds waiting for a reaction or a thank you message from Keanu, nothing appeared. No post, no statement, no acknowledgement. The official social media accounts of the show uploaded a short clip thanking viewers for tuning in, but they didn't reveal the backstage chaos. They didn't mention the headliner walking out. They didn't explain the impossible situation the band and crew had been thrown into. They simply shared the moment as it appeared, a quiet, powerful performance that arrived without warning and shook everyone watching. People began tagging Keanu, curious to see his response. They wrote messages praising his humility, his courage, his authenticity. Others speculated about the backstory, wondering whether he had planned it, rehearsed it, or collaborated secretly with the band. But Keanu remained completely silent. He didn't repost clips. He didn't comment on the show's page. He didn't follow any of the trending hashtags. While the world buzzed, he slipped away from the studio quietly, carrying his bass in one hand and offering polite goodnights to the few crew members still nearby. If people expected him to turn the moment into publicity, they were mistaken. The silence became part of the mystery and part of the magic. As the night rolled on, the online reaction only intensified. Viewers uploaded slowed-down edits, close-up screenshots, and audio-enhanced versions of the performance, each trying to capture what had made it so powerful. Music critics began chiming in on their feeds, surprised by the emotional weight of the moment. One critic wrote, "I've reviewed thousands of live performances. Tonight I witnessed a rare kind of vulnerability, unpolished and deeply human." Another added, "The brilliance of the moment wasn't technical skill. It was the quiet honesty. It reminded us why we fall in love with music in the first place." More comments flooded in. "I can't explain it, but I felt seen listening to that. That wasn't acting. That was real. I hope he knows he helped people tonight." Clips were shared across international communities too. Music lovers, film fans, late-night viewers, and even people who hadn't watched the broadcast but stumbled upon trending posts. Each group found themselves reacting the same way, with an emotional recognition that transcended language or culture. Yet, through all of it, Keanu remained absent from the conversation. There was no sudden surge of promotional activity on his accounts, no behind-the-scenes selfies, no public gratitude posts, no last-minute interviews arranged by management, nothing to imply he was trying to ride the wave of attention. The stillness felt almost intentional. Some fans speculated that he didn't want to take credit for a moment born out of crisis. Others believed he stayed silent to protect the other artists on the lineup from being overshadowed. A few pointed out that this was simply who he was, someone who believed moments didn't need to be amplified to have meaning. The band posted a brief message thanking viewers for the unexpected support, but even they didn't elaborate on the backstage chaos. They described the performance as one of those nights where something honest takes over, and left it at that. Musicians online began analyzing the arrangement itself. They broke down the grunge-inspired progression, complementing its restraint and emotional texture. Some even created tutorials to replicate the tone of Keanu's bass, praising its gritty simplicity. But the conversation always returned to the same point. It felt real. It felt human. It felt like something television rarely gives truth without polish. As dawn approached, thousands of comments turned into tens of thousands. The clip spread across continents, appearing in trending sections from Tokyo to Toronto. People compared it to viral performances from artists who had poured their souls into unexpected moments. Some viewers admitted they had looped the clip for hours, trying to understand why it touched them so deeply. Still, Keanu remained silent. While others debated, speculated, and praised him, he moved through the world, quietly refusing to add noise to something that had found its meaning long before anyone could label it. The performance belonged to the moment, not to him, and the silence only made people cherish it more. The studio parking lot was quieter than anyone expected after a night that had set the internet on fire. The vans were slowly rolling out, crew members were heading home, and the last bits of equipment were being pushed toward the loading dock. Fluorescent lights hummed over the pavement, casting long lines of pale light across the empty spaces. The intensity of the night had drained everyone, but there was also a strange sense of calm in the air, as if the building itself understood that something meaningful had taken place. Jamie walked beside Keanu, hugging her guitar case against her chest. She still had the remnants of excitement shimmering beneath her nerves. Everything she had witnessed tonight felt unreal, yet it had carved something permanent in her. She kept glancing at Keanu, trying to find the right words, trying to understand how someone so humble could carry a room the way he did. Keanu noticed her silence and gave her a gentle smile. He told her that the hardest part of any performance isn't singing or playing. The hardest part is deciding to step forward, even when fear circles around you. She nodded slowly, taking every word into her heart. Her mind replayed the moment he stepped onto that stage, the way he asked for no spotlight, the way he had stood there with nothing but a bass and a quiet kind of courage. They walked across the lot, their steps echoing lightly in the open space. Jamie finally broke the silence. She told him she never realized courage could look so ordinary. She admitted that in her mind, courage always looked like loud confidence or big declarations. But tonight changed that. It showed her that courage could be a soft voice, a simple choice, a moment offered when everything is falling apart. Keanu listened with patient eyes. He didn't rush her or brush off her feelings. He told her the world often teaches people to chase attention, noise, and applause. But truth lives in quiet spaces. Real artists, he said, do not perform to be praised. They perform to be honest. They perform to connect. They perform because something inside them refuses to stay silent. Jamie felt tears gather as she absorbed what he was saying. It wasn't just advice about music, it was advice about life. She realized that everything he did backstage, every calm gesture, every reassuring word, had prepared her for this moment of understanding. He hadn't stepped onto that stage to prove anything. He stepped forward because someone needed to. The simplicity of it overwhelmed her. As they reached her car, she paused beside the door, reluctant for the night to end. She thanked him for everything, not just the performance, but the example he had set. She told him she felt like she had been holding her breath for years, and tonight she finally exhaled. Keanu placed a warm hand on her shoulder and reminded her that moments like this are rare, but they shape the path ahead. He told her to remember that bravery is not loud, it's honest. Then he stepped back, giving her space to breathe, to think, to carry the lesson forward. Jamie opened her car door, but she didn't get in right away. She looked back at the studio building. Its tall glass doors now dimmed and quiet. Hours earlier, it had been a storm of fear and pressure. Now it felt different, like a place that had witnessed something small but important. She asked Keanu if he ever thought about how many lives he changed without realizing it. Her voice trembled as she spoke, not from nervousness, but from the weight of a truth she had only just discovered. Keanu shook his head gently. He told her that change isn't something people set out to accomplish like a task on a list. It happens naturally when someone chooses to do the right thing. He explained that the world measures success in numbers and attention, but real moments of meaning are often invisible. Most people never notice the quiet choices that keep things from falling apart, but those moments matter the most. Jamie nodded, finally understanding why he never chased the spotlight. She saw clearly now how a single act of stepping forward, done without expectation or reward, could ripple far beyond the moment itself. She promised him she would remember that every time she walked onto a stage. She would not perform to be perfect. She would perform to be truthful. Keanu smiled softly, proud of her, without saying it out loud. He reminded her that every performance in her life, big or small, would give her a chance to choose truth over fear. And if she kept choosing truth, the courage she longed for would eventually grow on its own. She thanked him again, this time with more strength in her voice, and finally settled into the driver's seat. He stepped back as she started the engine. The soft glow of the dashboard lit up her determined eyes. She gave him one last grateful look before driving away, her car rolling slowly out of the lot and disappearing onto the empty street beyond the gates. Once she was gone, the silence around Keanu deepened. He turned toward the night sky, taking in the cool air and the pale glow of streetlights stretching across the pavement. The city hummed softly in the distance, unaware of the night he had just lived through. He felt no triumph, no pride, just a quiet sense of completion. That was enough for him. As he walked toward his own car, he thought about the people inside the studio who would sleep easier tonight. Marcus, Rick, the band, the crew members who had been moments away from disaster. Jamie, who had found a piece of courage she didn't know she had. He didn't think of himself as the reason for any of it. He simply felt grateful he had been there at the right moment. When he finally closed his car door, he took one last look at the empty studio behind him and allowed a small, private smile to appear. He hadn't changed the world tonight, but he had changed a moment, and sometimes that was enough. When the studio finally fell silent and the night settled into memory, the meaning of what happened lingered in the air, like the last notes of a fading song. There was something powerful in the simplicity of it. A canceled show, a shattered plan, a moment on the verge of collapse. Yet in that fragile space, something unexpected rose to take its place. Not fame, not spectacle, not a rehearsed performance designed to impress. What stepped forward was something much quieter and far more rare. It was humility. It was courage. It was the belief that even the smallest act offered at the right time can steady an entire world. Keanu didn't arrive that night intending to save anything. He didn't walk into the studio imagining he would pick up a bass or stand under television lights. He came as a mentor, as a quiet presence, as a supporter of a young artist who needed steady guidance. The universe had other plans, and instead of resisting them, he simply responded with kindness. He saw fear in the eyes of the crew, stress building in the hallways, and a show crumbling under pressure. He didn't claim he could fix it. He didn't make a speech. He didn't wait for applause. He just offered himself in the simplest, most honest way possible. Moments like that remind us of something important. The world doesn't always turn on grand gestures or heroic acts done with cameras watching. Sometimes the balance of a day, a career, or even a person's confidence comes down to someone stepping forward quietly with no expectation of reward. Most of the time, these moments go unnoticed, but their impact is real. They create ripples in the lives they touch. They build courage where there was fear. They create calm where there was chaos. They make people feel seen when they thought they were invisible. Jamie felt that change. It wasn't the lights or the stage that transformed her. It was witnessing humility in action. She saw what bravery looked like without noise. She saw that fear doesn't vanish. It simply becomes something you learn to walk through. And because of that, she walked away stronger, more grounded, more certain of who she wanted to be. Marcus felt it too. In the middle of overwhelming pressure, he saw someone choosing compassion instead of ego. That single choice reminded him of his responsibility as a leader not just to create a successful broadcast, but to protect the people who made it possible. He realized how easily fear can erode trust and how quickly kindness can rebuild it. And the audience, even without knowing the story behind the performance, felt something honest reach them. They didn't need the backstage details. They didn't need an explanation. The truth reached them through a single voice singing under dim lights, stripped of spectacle, stripped of perfection, left with only emotion. That was enough. There is a lesson in that, a reminder for each of us. A reminder that strength often hides inside the gentlest actions. A reminder that what holds the world together is rarely the loudest voice in the room. It is the quiet decision to help, the steady choice to show up, the simple willingness to say yes when everyone else is too afraid to try. Even a moment that seems small can leave a mark that lasts for years. What happened on that stage wasn't about a celebrity stepping into the spotlight. It wasn't about saving a broadcast or rescuing ratings. It was about a person choosing to show up when he was needed, even though he didn't have to. It was about heart-guiding action instead of pride. It was about courage appearing in its most authentic form. And when the world saw that, even without knowing the full story, they felt something shift inside them. This is why stories like this matter. Not because they feature famous faces, but because they reveal truths about being human. They remind us that no one is too important to help, and no one is too small to make a difference. They show us that sometimes the right moment finds us unexpectedly, and whether or not it becomes meaningful depends on how we respond. Maybe someone watching tonight is dealing with fear the way Jamie once did. Maybe someone is standing on the edge of a dream, afraid of taking the next step because they feel unprepared or unworthy. Maybe someone is overwhelmed by responsibilities the way Marcus was trying to hold a fragile day together before it breaks apart. Or maybe someone simply needs to be reminded that kindness still has power, even in a world that often forgets it. If you are one of those people, then let this night serve as a quiet encouragement. You don't need a spotlight. You don't need perfection. You don't need applause. You only need one moment of courage, one small act of honesty, one step forward when your heart tells you it matters. The world may never know about your moment, but someone will feel the impact of it. Someone will breathe easier because you chose to show up. Keanu didn't leave the studio thinking he had done something extraordinary. He didn't think about how far the performance would travel online. He didn't wonder how people would interpret his choice. He simply smiled to himself, grateful that he was able to help keep the night from falling apart. Grateful that Jamie walked away braver. Grateful that people found something real in a world full of noise. And that is the quiet truth this story leaves us with. Greatness is not always loud. Sometimes it is the softest action in the room. Sometimes it comes from someone who never planned to be a hero. Sometimes it appears in a moment that almost never happened. But when it does, it reminds us that we are all capable of making a difference, no matter who we are. As you finish this story, take a moment to reflect. Have you witnessed a quiet act of courage like this? Have you ever stepped forward when someone needed you, even when you weren't ready? Or did someone once save your day with a small gesture that changed everything? Share your thoughts or your own story in the comments. Your words may inspire someone who needs encouragement tonight. And if this incredible story touched you, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating stories that remind us of the goodness still alive in the world. Like the video, share it with someone who might need hope, and join us for the next story.